Good morning, friends. Here's a story from the book of Genesis. Joseph's brothers had sold him as a slave to the Egyptians many years ago. They thought he was probably dead by now. But Joseph had become an important man in Egypt, helping the government give out grain to people from the region when there was little to eat. The brothers traveled from their home to Egypt to see if they could find food for their families. Little did they know they would have to ask for help from their brother Joseph. Joseph's brothers, whom he hadn't seen for many years, were standing in front of him. They didn't recognize him. And Joseph said to them, "Look, it's me. It's Joseph. Is my father still alive?" His brothers could hardly talk. They were so shocked to see him. "Come closer," Joseph said. "I am your brother, Joseph, the one you sold into slavery so many years ago. But God turned that into a good thing, so I've forgiven you. I work for the Pharaoh now, and I'm in charge of getting grain to people who need it during this famine. Go home and tell our father that I'm alive, that God has blessed me by making me very important here in Egypt. Then bring him here along with your families and flocks. I will provide for you here, because I've got plenty of food." And he kissed all his brothers, and they cried together for a long time. And after that, they talked long into the night. Sibling relationships always make for interesting drama, especially in the Bible. Think about the very first brothers, Cain and Abel, and then there's Esau and Jacob. Joseph was a little brother who was, of course, a tattletale, who told on his older brothers and constantly got them into trouble with Dad. The big brothers hated him for this, and they schemed to get rid of him by throwing him in a pit. Then, when they thought better of it, they instead sold him off to slavery in Egypt. Joseph's life turns around in Egypt, and he holds a very responsible position in Pharaoh's administration. Years later, the brothers show up looking for food, and Joseph toys with them for a while. Really, he toys with them for a long while, like chapters and chapters in Genesis. He disguises himself, speaks to them in Egyptian and not Hebrew, accuses them of being spies, sends them back to home to get their youngest brother Benjamin. When they bring Benjamin back, and they receive the grain they've requested, and they're ready to return home, Joseph has a silver cup planted in Benjamin's bag and imprisons him for theft. Now, you can't blame Joseph for enjoying watching them squirm. You also can't blame the brothers for thinking that they were in deep, deep trouble. Finally, he reveals himself. Joseph proclaims that although his brothers had meant him harm, God redeemed the situation for good, and there is happy crying all around. The family is reunited. Everyone has food. It seems Joseph has forgiven his brothers. Whether or not his brothers ever forgave him, we are not told. God had reached into their history and flooded it with grace. Joseph's proclamation that God took the situation that the brothers meant for harm and turned it to good sounds good. And I've often used that when times are tough to get me through. But it's also can be a very dangerous theology if you take it too far. It can be used to shift the blame for human behavior onto God and God's will. A theology like this has been and continues to be used by those who see the enslavement of millions of Africans as part of the larger plan from God to spread the gospel to them here in America and save their souls. And today's story continues with Jacob and his sons and their families settling in Egypt, where eventually they become slaves for 400 years. I've heard people say God sent this pandemic so that the church would change. That might be the result of the pandemic, but certainly not the purpose of it. There is grace in every situation, and we should devote ourselves to finding it, to hanging on to that grace, and then asking God to enable us to turn things around for good. God can open our eyes to ways that can happen. God can help us see what is good in every situation. In Luke's gospel today, Jesus talks about loving our enemies, to see what is good in every person. We need God's help to do that too, because it certainly doesn't come to us naturally. What feels good when someone hates us is to get revenge and to make them squirm, to give them a dose of their own medicine. But just because it feels good doesn't mean it's the right course of action. This passage in the gospel is not about passively letting the other do whatever they want with no consequence. It's about actively being generous with forgiveness, with that source of generosity being God's love toward us. We are the recipients of God's grace, God's forgiveness. Our lives and our behavior towards others must be extensions of that love. There is power in forgiving, in loving without measure, in giving with no expectation of return. Pray with me, please. O Lord, give us the courage to invite your forgiveness and healing into old wounds, and to cross the lines between your people which need to be crossed, to count on your love and grace to flow freely to transform us all. Amen. God bless each of you.